for coming. So here's my abstract. It's kind of a wall of text. Sorry about that. It's on a handout. So I thought what I want to do was just say why there's maybe a harder problem about consciousness in philosophy of mind, harder than other things. Some people think that this is an unsolvable hard problem, and I would hope that it's not. And I'm kind of interested in the more philosophical end of it. Why arguments that there's this unsolvable problem, I'm going to suggest, are not successful. But I'm not necessarily going to get there. I just want to talk a bit about some issues in philosophy of mind, indicate why, in effect, the strategies that people use for solving other problems don't seem to work so well, or at least so easily, in the case of consciousness, and then maybe say a bit about where we could go from there, or maybe not. That depends on how things go. A couple of sections here. Introduction, philosophy of mind. What is philosophy of mind? Philosophy of mind attempts to answer questions about the nature of mind or mentality. And you might say, aren't those questions for psychology or cognitive science or neuroscience? And you'd be right. But they're also questions for philosophy too. I don't think that there's any terribly sharp division between, say, conceptual questions and empirical questions, or rather it's just kind of a matter of degree. And there are questions to ask of a more conceptual nature and of a more empirical nature, and these things have to be asked simultaneously rather than one prior to the other, or in exclusion to the other. So here's my little taxonomy of mental states from a kind of initial common sense sort of approach. I'm going to introduce some technical terms here. I'm going to introduce the technical term thinky state. Then I'm going to introduce the technical term feely state. And the technical term consciousy state. Here's just some examples of mental states or phenomena that you might want a theory to explain or refine our understanding of to begin with. So under thinky states, I put things like belief, credence is potentially a slightly more technical version of that. It's more like degree of confidence, comes in degrees rather than yes, no. Desire, want, preference, and then things like making a decision, making a plan, forming an intention, and then carrying it through. Planning, reasoning, deliberation, memory is an important one. Those are what I'm going to generically call thinky states. Like I said, technical term. Some contrasts. One important contrast is with what I'm going to call it another technical term, feely states. Feely states are things like the feel of cold water running over your hand, the taste of mint, the burning sensation you get after accidentally biting into a hot pepper, that you didn't know was there maybe in your Chinese food. Visual experiences of colors, bodily sensations. And I'm going to have here's a third category. This is just supposed to be a kind of initial, broad sort of idea of what we want to talk about. I'm going to call these consciously states, and it's hard to say what those are. But here's a couple of them. Attention. You can direct your attention on various things, and you can do it voluntarily, seemingly, to some extent. Awareness. The term consciousness, oh God, I don't know. Don't know whether the relation between consciousness and awareness and attention would be tricky in any tricky theoretical issue. But that's just supposed to be, here's some things that we'd be interested in talking about, or interested in getting an understanding of what they are in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, possibly even neuroscience. It looks like, at least from a kind of starting from an initial common sense perspective, there are two features that kind of disjunctively, jointly or disjunctively, capture the things that we think of as mental features. And these are, on the one hand, intentionality or intentional states, on the other hand, what people call phenomenal states. And then there's well, anyway, so the intentional states are ones that are about things, that represent things as being a certain way. Your beliefs and your memories do that. Phenomenal states are ones that it feels like something to have, and those are what I was trying to call the feely states. So, for example, memories and beliefs are intentional, but they often don't feel like anything. It doesn't feel like anything to have them. So, maybe, what's your address? You know your address, and you can think of it. But you knew it, and you had a memory of it 2 minutes ago when you weren't thinking about it. It didn't feel like anything to have that memory, so to speak. And here, while we're sitting here, it's possible that you lost some memory from your childhood. It went away, and it didn't feel like anything when you had it, and didn't feel like any different when you lost it. That sort of thing is possible. So they don't really feel like anything, whereas the feel of cold water running on your hands does. Consciousness, awareness, attention seem like to combine both of these. You're directing your attention on something, it seems to be both about something and to have some kind of feel to it too. Emotions also seem to have both of these features. And this is just supposed to be, this is kind of a rough gesture in the direction of what you would want to be interested in if you were interested in explaining mental phenomena. Things that have these intentional features or these feely features or both. Okay, that's something we might be interested in. There's something that I'm going to call the representational theory of mind. And this goes back, I guess, I say with trepidation to John Locke and David Hume, possibly before that. And it's a general idea, possibly incomplete, of a number of mental phenomena. And the idea is thinking consists in your doing something with inner mental representations. So there's two questions for this. What's the actions? What are the representations? Hume, I say with trepidation in the 18th century, the representations are sensory images. I say that with trepidation because Johnny Cottrell here is a Hume scholar, and I expect to be corrected. And Hume seemed to think of thinking like a kind of sequence of images in your mind, in the imagination. This is maybe an interesting start towards something, thinking that thinking is going on in your head rather than involving objects outside of you. But there are problems like, well, what's the mental image of not? You can imagine a cube. Imagine something that's not a cube. There doesn't seem to be any image of not a cube. Same for or, something. Here's a sentence. Either someone is in the next room or there's no coffee in the lounge. Perfectly good sentence, makes perfect sense. It's a thought you could have, or at least thinking it is a thought you could have, and yet there don't seem to be mental images. There's an image of coffee, but it says there's no coffee. What? I don't understand. So you need something, on this approach you need some language-like representations. One view, Jerry Fodor from the 70s on, there's a language of thought, which he calls mentalese. The idea is that this language somehow unifies all the, on the face of it, we got all these different kinds of mental representations. You got sensory ones, ones that kind of, feel like language in talking to yourself, all kinds of representations, and linguists think syntax is going to be psychologically real. All kinds of representations. The language of thought is supposed to be a kind of lingua franca for all of them. It's kind of speculative hypothesis. I don't have anything especially to say about that. I'm sorry I forgot your name. You were mentioning?
Dave Kelton.
Dave was mentioning it. I know Johnny teaches a bit on this. A possibility. But maybe there are many different kinds of representations which fit together in different ways. Okay, what are the actions? Those are questions. What's the representation? I didn't answer that question. Question, what's the action? I'm not going to answer that question either. What are the actions? But the idea is you can do different things with these representations. Here's like a zeroth approximation account, or beginning of a zeroth approximation account, beginning the start of a zeroth approximation account of what belief would be. It would be something like taking one of these representations and making it available for inferences. Inferences that are potentially action guided. The difference between a belief and a supposition or just a kind of daydream is you're willing to act on the beliefs. I imagine, well, anyway. And sometimes, there can be slippage, like when you're angry at your spouse or significant other, and then you realize, oh wait, you did that in a dream. It kind of made its way from straight to dream to memory and skipped the part where you shouldn't have done that. There's a couple versions of this. Here's like a common sense version, and then there's a more kind of mathematically cleaned up version, and none of them are actually right for actual humans, but something to work with. So 2 versions, folk psychology, people sometimes call it, belief desire psychology. And you could do decision theory. So, sorry for the wall of text, but folk psychology, or belief desire psychology would say people perform the actions they do on the basis of 2 main considerations. One is, what do they believe the world is like? And the other is, how do they want it to be? And they pick an action on the basis of their belief about how likely that action is to lead to desirable consequences in the world. So you could have inner representations of how the world is and how you want it to be, and what the effect of an action that you perform is going to be, and you choose actions on the basis of that, is the idea of folk psychology. And I think decision theory is a kind of cleaned up version of that in a way, or a mathematically cleaner version of that. Instead of beliefs, agents have credences. These are like graded degrees of confidence. And instead of desires, they have preferences, which are more like rankings of how desirable various outcomes are. And then a decision rule. The decision rule, you could have different decision rules. Standard one is maximize expected utility, or basically just perform the actions most likely according to your credences to have the highest payoff overall, according to one's preferences. Yeah?
This almost sounds like some kind of computer language.
Yes, that's the point. The whole point of the representational theory of mind is that the mind, I shouldn't say that, but say in overly rough terms, yeah, mind is a computer. That's the idea. That's the idea of this representational theory of mind. Exactly. And obviously, actual agents aren't like this in many, many ways. I say framing of facts. People make decisions in ways where they're, risk-taking with respect to gains and risk-averse with respect to losses, and all kinds of things like that. And so these are kind of like first pass ideas that you might use to explain human action. But that's the idea, is that the mind is a computer. There's a promise of this. Promise is it can do something otherwise seemingly mysterious. It can rationalize action and inference. So, for example, logic and computability show how manipulations among symbols can be truth-preserving. You could make an inference from this one to that one, and if the first one's true, then the second one's true. They can have, truthy properties. They can have semantic properties. And it can be done inside your head. And the other inferences, other promises, that it could rationalize action. If you pick actions based on how likely you think they are to lead to outcomes that you find valuable or desirable, well, that seems like that seems like what a rational action would be, or at least one way in which an action could be rational. So you're getting this, this kind of promise of this theory to do something otherwise difficult to explain. Explain how how a mere causal process going on in your head could be rational and could lead to rational action. That's a promise. There's another, possibly even greater promise in a way, and that's that this sort of account could explain how minds fit into a physical world. Ultimately, we would think or hope, or at least speculate, that the sorts of activities that with which RTM, this representational theory of mind, identifies thinking, you would think that thinking according to this representational theory of mind is something that could be done by a brain. And it's something that could be done by a physical object, not a purely physical object. Now this is speculative in a way, but it's a cool speculation. It's like, hey, this could actually work to make sense of a lot of stuff. And again, speculative. But on this account, no ghosts or material spirits seem to be needed. Seem to be needed for thinking, for rational action, rational thought, rational inference, rational action. Yeah.
You didn't start with the theological basis where historically mind was always considered non-material, like the mind and soul were synonymous,
Yes.
assumed to survive death.
I did not start there, and we can talk about that.
I mean, the theories today might say those people were right in a lot of their explanations, but they were incorrect that mind and soul are the same, but mind is actually body.
I mean, I'm a little bit unsure what to say, like, about, I actually find the term soul unclear. I just don't know what it is. It could be different things, and we could ask, what nature, what you think it's like, and then, whether that exists or not. I didn't start with the theological basis.
Even
This is-
Aristotle or Plato refers to it as the mind as the soul,
Sure.
surviving death.
Yeah, yeah. On this view the most natural understanding of this view, the mind would not survive death, because when the brain goes away, the basis of thinking goes away, and that would be it. So that'd be the most natural understanding of this view. It's not probably required, but that'd be it'd be a natural supplement to it.
Okay, so that ghost is something that's going to survive death or to leave the body, or might even not be part of the body at all.
Right. So one view that is natural to have, the term spirit. The term spirit is Latin for breath, spiritus. And a view that's been natural for the whole history of humanity is that there is some thing, you might think of it like a ghost or breathy thing, that goes away when you die. And that is somehow responsible for, or the carrier of, these sorts of things. And it's responsible for your doing these things, and it's responsible for you having these thoughts and feeling these feely things. This view promises, at least, to say that those things are not explanatorily needed. They're not needed to explain those phenomena. Now, whether that works or not is a difficult question, but that's the promise of it. I mean, it holds out that promise. There's one thing. Okay, I wanted to say something about how this view would, in outline, explain mental phenomena, and then I want to raise a problem for it, and then wonder about it. And that's kind of where, and then I could give you my own stupid little take on some of these things. But that's kind of where I'm going. So yes, I mean, you're asking good questions, and I appreciate that. Here's a kind of even more general version of this, of the idea behind this representational theory of mind. And it's sometimes called functionalism, and that term is used in a confusing variety of ways, and I propose that we not worry about it. However, let me explain one version of the idea of functionalism just in an example. So, you might ask a question like, what's memory? And the functionalist idea is, don't ask what it is, but ask what it does. And so you might say, as a zeroth approximation account of memory, it's a process by means of which a subject has access to present access to information about the past, that she was exposed to in the past. And then you might say, well, here are some things we need memory to do. Here are some slightly more specific things. We need to encode information, store it, and retrieve it. And then you might say, well, here's a way of encoding, well, you might just ask, how do humans go about performing these sorts of tasks with respect to different kinds of information? So, for example, you can just tell, and you can see in yourself, it's easier to recognize a face than remember a name. To put a name with it, that's something in our experience, so that supports the hypothesis that the encoding is done differently. And then you could work, as cognitive scientists do, to try to spell out functions in greater detail, worry about what subserves these functions, and how it could be done by something, ultimately, even possibly something like a brain. And you can get evidence both in both directions. That is, from the bottom up, people with certain with brain lesions seem to lose specific functions, and then from the top down, you can just do tests about people's reaction times and how quickly they can pick things out, and tests of cognitive capacities from the top down. So you can do both of those things. But the hope is, if it worked, you could get a generally functionalist account of how memory works and how it's implemented in something possibly even like a human brain. So that would be the kind of hope or promise there. And that would be a kind of physicalism. Or at least it would be a step towards a kind of physicalist view. I think I've got a slide called Physicalism. Rough idea, everything's physical. I'm going to leave it at that. So I said that the title of this talk was why there's a harder problem of consciousness in the philosophy of mind. And the answer is because this sort of account, the sort of functionalist account, going through this representational theory of mind, it doesn't look like it works, or at least works so easily, for the feely states, the phenomenal states. Ones like, this is my little list, the experience of tasting mint, the feel of cold water running over your hand, the burning sensation you get after biting into a hot pepper, bodily sensations like pains and aches. It doesn't look like it works or works easily, and so some people think there's a challenge there. I want to try to bring out that challenge and just maybe leave it at that, or I could say more about how one might go out answering it. Note the following thing. In all these cases, except the last, I describe this state by means of its external causes. Yes?
Is that the who is the I problem? Like, I feel pain? Who is the I that feels it?
I'm not actually raising worries about, say, unity or subjective consciousness. Now, you could raise such worries. The cases that point up here are hard enough. Let's we can worry about all these things, but these ones for the moment. The experience of tasting mint. That description describes it in terms of mint leaves. I mean, mint is a plant.
In terms of physical stimuli?
Not even in terms of physical stimuli. Well, maybe chewing mint leaves. I don't know whether you'd call that a stimulus or not, but mint's a plant, and the description of the thing, the description of the state is, it's the state you get when you stick these things in your mouth and chew them. That's a description in terms of typical causes of the thing. Cold water, cold water is a physical stuff, and we're describing this state in terms of what usually brings it about. Same for hot peppers. Colors are a harder or much harder case, but they at least appear to be on physical objects. Bodily sensations, harder there too. But okay, these descriptions are, I think, are pretty clearly not the nature of the state. So, for example, maybe there's a group of people in the Amazon who don't get, when they chew mint leaves, who don't get the sensation we get. This is, this is clearly, this sort of thing is actual. Cilantro tastes like soap to some people, and some people it tastes like a delicious herb. Here's a case, just hypothetical case, group of people in the Amazon, due to some evolutionary accident, they don't get the sensation that we get upon chewing mint leaves. Given different evolutionary history, maybe that could have been everybody. Maybe cilantro, given different evolutionary history, cilantro tastes like soap for everybody. So a phrase like, the experience of chewing mint leaves is not getting at, apparently not getting at this sensation. Possible, same external cause, different sensation. It's also possible the other way. It seems apparently possible, at least, for somebody to have the sensation that we get from chewing on mint leaves from chewing on something else. Cilantro, maybe. That's probably unrealistic. But something else. That seems possible too. So it seems like the way I described the sensation and the nature of the thing can come apart in both directions. Here's maybe, I think I do pain here. So imagine how you would start with a kind of functionalist account of pain. Remember, we started with a functionalist account of memory and hoped to break it down into further functions and different kinds of encoding for different kinds of stimuli and things like that. How would you start with pain? Here's my zeroth approximation account. Pain is the ABC, the aversive behavior causer. It's the thing such that when you have it, you engage in aversive behavior. It has high disvalue. You try to get out of the state of having it. It prevents concentration. It overrides tendencies of. It overrides, higher cognitive thought. You will involuntarily do things that you know you shouldn't do to get out of this state. This is just a zeroth sort of pass at what you might think the pain does, a kind of functional role for pain. But it seems possible, at least, that there could be a creature that has a state like that, but it doesn't feel like this. I don't know, imagine burning your hand on the pan when you pull it out of the oven. It seems possible that a creature has a state that does this but doesn't feel like that. And it also seems possible to me, though we could worry about it, that you could have a state that feels like that and doesn't have any tendency to cause aversive behavior. You might be paralyzed. There's also supposedly this condition called pain asymbolia, where people feel pain and don't care about it. Seems possible. I mean, we don't need to get distracted on that, but it seems possible at least. So, okay, here's just a sort of challenge. Some people say that there's this explanatory gap, or this conceptual or epistemic gap. And they say that there's a difference here. So they say, suppose you're presented with this great ideal account of how memory works for humans and is implemented in the brain. There isn't any further question. There's nothing left. There isn't a question. They say, this question doesn't really make any sense. Oh, but why is that really memory? They say, that question is answered. It's kind of conceptually answered. But they say, this sort of question is not remains open. Why is the aversive behavior causer, why does it feel like that? Why couldn't something else do that, or that not? Why couldn't something else be the aversive behavior causer? Something other than that? And why does that have to be the aversive behavior causer? And they think, there's a sensible question there. This question, sensible to ask, or at least there's a kind of, people have this feeling that there's a kind of gap. that there isn't in this case, like with memory. Okay, so that's the answer. It's a beginning of an answer to the question to my title. The question suggested by my title. The title is why there is a harder problem with consciousness. And the answer is that the strategies on offer for explaining memory, for example, don't seem to give you the same sort of, don't seem to work in quite the same way for these states of phenomenal consciousness. Now I could say more about this. I've got another section that says, so arguments against physicalism and maybe some responses. This is kind of trying to like turn those considerations into a kind of argument against physicalism, and maybe we can respond to that, or we could just stop here and discuss what we have so far. Your preference, yes.
Why? Why does physicalism require a representational theory of mind, which seems to be where you started from? Couldn't you have physicalism without having representational theory of mind?
Certainly physicalism does not require a representational theory of mind. Depending on what options you have in mind, you could say, so here's why physicalism kind of plausibly goes with the representational theory of mind, because the representational theory of mind looks capable of explaining the sorts of phenomena that we want to explain, at least that you might think we want to explain, starting from a kind of common sense psychology. You might say, junk common sense psychology, and let's just go for a fully maybe connectionist view, or maybe a fully behaviorist view, and say, get rid of mentality altogether. Or, so there are lots of options there, but it looks like that, suppose if you want to start with explaining some approximation to common sense psychology, the representational theory of mind does that, seems to do it nicely. But so what
I guess I'm just
options?
not convinced that the representational theory equals the common sensical view, but
Okay.
I don't have any agenda here. I'm just, I generally don't.
Yeah, fair enough.
Do you agree that it works well on the thinky part?
Maybe. I'm not sure that any representational theory of mind will explain why people vote for Donald Trump, for instance.
Why they vote for
Why they vote for
Donald
Donald
Trump?
Trump.
Oh yeah, they hate black people. That's easy.
But
Why do you say that that's difficult? And their hatred of black people trumps whatever else they think is important. There you go. That's not.
Isn't it also common sense to say people don't make rational decisions at all? They get carried away by their passions. They
Yes.
do silly things, which in their
Yes.
own minds in better moments they think that's ridiculous. Why am I doing this? But yet
Yes.
they do them anyway.
So this is one of the things I mentioned. So suppose you started with this kind of decision theoretic account of rationality, then you'd have to say, okay, people are not like that in numerous ways.
Yeah.
But you could potentially use it as an ideal to kind of triangulate on what people are doing. So for example, in these framing effects, people will use decision theory and say, oh, here's how people are acting. They're risk averse when it comes to losses, and risk seeking when it comes to gains. So that's not like, as it were, it's not what you would think of as a rational approach from decision theory. But if you didn't have decision theory in the background, you wouldn't even be able to describe their behavior. It's like their behavior is kind of partly rational and partly not.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I
explain
just still wonder about it, but I don't want to drag the conversation.
No, it's okay. You're not dragging it. Yeah, Dave, right?
yeah, Professor Esway, the woman who spoke about decision theory and showed that the evidence was people don't actually respond to logic. It's a different, and maybe that fits in with the main question I was at, who is the holistic I? So an individual person, if it's just a bunch of electrical impulses, we act on our memory. We have a stimuli that triggers our memory in some sort of thinking function, and we're actually not logical beings, and it's more a function of our memory. But It's some sort of model. There is no
We're partially
holistic.
logical beings.
But I think there is no holistically I that makes rational decisions where a function of,
Multiple kind of semi-coordinated units, homunculi or something like that.
well, hence the popularity of the soul theory, say the mind as a soul is this non-physical conceptual I that controls the body, but if you're looking at it purely as a physicalistic system,
Mhm.
it's electrical systems and there's a whole bunch of stimuli
Yeah.
and it triggers memory that makes some sort of decision, and there
Here's
is no
something-
holistic I.
Here's something that's relevant to that. Some physicalists, I think they do more, or can do more than they really can. So, nothing in either the representational theory of mind or in other sorts of accounts is strictly inconsistent with there being an immaterial mind. The argument against there being an immaterial mind is kind of a redundancy argument. It's like, we can explain this, we can explain this, we can explain this, we can explain this. What's left for the immaterial mind to do? Nothing really. So it's a kind of parsimony Occam's razor hypothesis sort of argument.
I mean, the holistic I, there's no need to find one.
Well, I don't know about the holistic I, but I'm a little bit unsure what you mean by that. But the overall argument for physicalism is this kind of parsimony argument, I think. I think sometimes physicalists think they can prove more than they can, but the parsimony argument is pretty plausible to me.
I mean, man as a rational being requires a holistic I to make rational choices. If there's no holistic I, it's just a whole bunch of sensory data that has different levels of
There's
control,
a lot of issues there.
conflicting.
It's a computer.
Aaron, there's a question over here someone's been trying to ask.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that the missing link is the idea that somehow if you're a physicalist, you can't also explain irrational behavior. And that doesn't strike me as necessarily true.
Yeah, certainly can explain irrational
No,
behavior.
the opposite. The
I mean-
physicalist is man's not a rational being at all.
I think the worry that some people were raising, I guess, I thought Steve was raising, I might have been reading something into what he was saying. I thought the worry was people aren't rational enough for these sorts of, for this style of physicalism even to get a hold, like explaining people's actions by means of semi-rational considerations of options and what they lead to and those sorts of concerns. So I think physicalism can explain irrational behavior, but
Can't explain
I guess
rational behavior.
people are saying, yeah,
Why
okay,
isn't
sorry.
this an apt
Continue.
analogy? You do physics and you think of frictionless planes. You can make a lot of sense by,
Who's the I that thinks that?
well, I don't know, it's an analogy. Let me finish the analogy. So you do physics and you think of frictionless planes and that simplifies things. And then, but there aren't frictionless planes, but you introduce then this into reality, there are friction. And so you think here's an ideal rational agent would behave according to the representative theory of mind, representational theory of mind, and then you introduce friction. There are other things, other preferences and whatnot that make us deviate from what the
Well,
pure theory would say.
So that sounds like a performance error,
Yeah.
like
No.
linguists would say. Like you can describe sentences that are just plain difficult to understand, but then they make perfect sense grammatically, but they're just hard to parse. But it's probably more than that. I mean, the departures from rationality are more than performance errors. They're like deep-seated. Like, no, this is what people ignore base rates, positive instance.
But basically,
fallacies,
the
and
analogy is you
confirmation.
have this simple ideal theory, and then whatever, if this analogy isn't apt to account for all the deviations, of course.
Yeah.
But the big general idea is it's best to have an ideal theory and then to introduce deviations according to how things actually work.
That's possible. I mean, does that answer?
I think I take it one step further. The way that Bruce is describing it is you want to give a priority somehow to rational behavior as part of your explanation. It seems to me you could just as well turn it upside down. You start with human beings as being animals and then introduce rationality as a sort of subroutine in the way we process stuff. We ordinarily start by reacting emotionally, and then we also have learned to control our emotions. Either way, you could deal with it in physicalism.
You got a theory, though, about the emotions that is cool as the one about the mind?
So,
I'm married to a Freudian therapist, so
That's what the
somewhere there
research
is
shows.
one.
so these are
Know about
obviously,
that.
these are obviously empirical questions, all of them, and but the grounds that you two are arguing about are accepting kind of what I would think of as the main thesis, and you could approach it from different angles. You could say we are emotional creatures, and reason comes in as merely to give us rationalizations for what we're going to do anyway. Or you could say we are rational creatures who are strongly motivated by emotions, and you can say any number of things in between those. But those are agreeing on what I would take to be the central point. That states of this sort do motivate us. I mean, I think it's obvious that we are sensitive to rational concerns on utterly mundane things that you would have be other. I mean, why are you in this room as opposed to the one next door? I mean, if you wanted to explain that, it's my emotions drew me into this room. No, it's because the number on the door is the one that you saw and cognized and remembered, and that's clearly a bit of behavior that you could even overlook it in terms of its utter mundanity, utter mundaneness. But you would need some broadly rational account for that. Yeah, sorry, Kathy.
Oh, I was wondering if physicalism is necessarily incompatible with the view that phenomenal states supervene and sort of the brain activity. Is it?
Physicalism, is it necessarily incompatible with
Yeah.
that? So as usually understood, physicalism, the proper characterization of physicalism is really pretty kind of an intricate thing. But it's usually understood something like this. Everything is composed of only physical parts. And all the properties of the whole, say that you, are determined by, that is necessitated by, the properties and arrangements of those parts. On that sort of view, on that understanding of physicalism, these phenomenal states, the feely states, would have to be supervenient on or determined by or necessitated by the properties and arrangement of the physical parts in order for them to be physical. So you could say, I mean, there are different ways of being a non-physicalist. So you could have a kind of immaterial soul that persists after death.
Aristotle, Plato.
Yes. Well, not clear whether they persist, but for Aristotle, for example. But anyway, doesn't matter. That's a lot of people have thought that. But you could also be a more subtle kind of non-physicalist and say that these phenomenal fields are something like super duper emergent properties. They are only loosely tied to your physical, the properties and arrangement of your physical parts. And that view is somewhat popular nowadays. It's a way of being a non-physicalist that doesn't accept immaterial souls as much as what I just called super duper emergent properties.
Is that what supervenance is? It's emergent? Can you say what is supervenance? What is that relationship? I don't understand. You can skip.
Yeah.
This is actually a bit intricate. Your rough idea of materialism would be everything's material, right? But there's complications. So, for example, is a chair a physical object? Well, it's not an object of fundamental physics. It's nothing that is studied in a particle accelerator. But why is it physical? Well, it's made out of physical stuff. And it's made only out of physical stuff. stuff. Okay, so that's how a chair would get to be a physical object. But what about the properties of the chair? Are the properties of the chair physical properties of fundamental particles? Absolutely not. There is no fundamental particle that has the temperature of the chair, or the mass of the chair, or the shape or volume, or whatever you like of the chair. But those properties of the chair, like we think the mass of the chair is a kind of simple additive sum of the masses of its parts. In other cases, it's more complicated. Sort of like the temperature of the chair is not going to be an additive sum, but a kind of average. And so it's tricky when you say, what is it to be a physical property, as opposed to maybe what I called in my technical terms, super duper emergent properties. So that's kind of a tricky distinction. And people usually want to understand it something like this, though the details are not here and are potentially worrisome. Here's something like the sort of account that I prefer. Minimal duplication supervenience. Take the whole world, any minimal duplicate of it, anything that duplicates, any possible thing that duplicates its basic physical parts and their relations, it duplicates it in every respect. That's more abstract. But so some people would say, so here's one thing that a super duper emergent property could be, a property that is the difference between me and my physical duplicate. And so physicalism is committed to saying that the phenomenal states can't differ among physical duplicates.
Like
Yeah.
Thomas Kuhn, like a paradigm shift. 200 years ago, everybody who has thoughts on mind, basically mind is synonymous with soul.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the Kuhnian paradigm shift, where today basically
Yes.
everybody with thoughts on mind is evolutionary. However, where we try to superimpose, we say, okay, we can't take Aristotle and Plato and even Descartes and Hume and all these people's view on mind, because they looked at mind as soul, and so we're trying to superimpose this old soul paradigm of what mind means on the current paradigm of if it's physicalism or evolutionaryism, and that's the nature of the problem.
Well, you say it's the nature of the problem.
Or for your
I'm not
research.
sure what the problem is, but there have been paradigm shifts in the way people think about mind. People think about mind much more in terms of language, and in terms of things like, well, what you can do with language. Everybody thinks, I shouldn't say everybody, people think syntax is real, is psychologically real, and they want their semantics to match their syntax, and this is doing stuff with, well, language that people didn't even conceive of. I mean, Hume did not understand. Well, people didn't conceive of this until the last century. That you could do such things, and people are using it in an attempt to understand minds. And there's been a paradigm shift, yes, absolutely. But I don't see that. That by itself isn't the problem.
And Jim Johnny.
I'm going to say Johnny.
I'm just not so sure about this point about paradigm shifts. Materialism about the mind is at least as old as the ancient atomists. You get it in Lucretius, and he was presumably getting it from his sources as well. You get it again, I don't know the medieval period so well, but Thomas Willis, who was a rough contemporary of Descartes, was positive thinking matter, and Locke took that hypothesis seriously. So I sort of think if you look at the historical records, you actually get disagreement going, at least as far back as the ancient world. And so it seems like the subject matter itself, the subject matter of mentality, actually can be grasped independently of taking a positive stand on whether mentality is wholly physically realized or requires some sort of immaterial realizer.
That's what I was trying to do with my my silly little distinction between thinky states and feely states and consciously states. I think we can get a grasp on that independently of, well, at least somewhat independently of any grand theory. Yeah, no, but, oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
fascinating listening to the philosophers, but I was wondering if the last part you said if there was time, maybe you could look at possible solutions. But I was thinking in sort of more practical ways. For example, as Steve talked about, why people like Donald Trump. And what's really interesting to me about that, his whole sort of campaign and the response to him, is looking at when they interview people and they ask them, why do you support him? They believe, they just believe. Because if you confront them or they're confronted with actual facts, they still don't, it doesn't change their devotion to him as a candidate. So in terms of consciousness and building awareness, what happens on that level? Is it sort of like blind faith, where they just refuse to consider the material, actual proof that he lied about this, you know, or the truth about what's actually happening in the country right now?
I don't know. I mean,
You're saying as opposed
there,
to someone else.
there's got to
that's
be a
logical.
certain amount.
Well, just being logical, period, not.
It's
Not
logical
for
for a
them
white man to
necessarily.
support Donald Trump. It's logical for a black man to
No,
support.
No. Just the thinking process itself. The capacity for people to sort of embrace the idea of Donald Trump as he has sold himself, even though that idea and that representation is so full of holes, and it's been pointed out
But
time and time again, you know, that
I don't have any great universal explanation for human irrationality. I hope we can accept that it's
I should know that.
verified by common. It's verified. It's sufficiently verified by common sense and common observation that people believe what the hell they want to believe.
As opposed to us rational people.
And
who
they make
support
a,
Hillary
and
Clinton.
they ignore, reinterpret, otherwise fudge the evidence as you know as suits them. They do feel the need sometimes to do that, and I hope over time that people can come to see. But it doesn't. It's not like you're gonna. I don't think. People believe what they want to believe, and I think it's mostly okay. This is completely psychological speculation on the side. It's when people's self-conception gets involved and their kind of ego gets involved that they feel the most need to make shit up to justify that and verify that. And if they have made it part of their self-conception, part of their group identity, that they think of Trump as a leader of their group, and so they have to. That's one motive for believing what you want to believe and making the rest up.
And denying evidence.
I'm denying evidence. Yeah, Bruce, sorry.
So, it seems the problem that you've raised today anyway is that if you try to specify necessary and sufficient conditions for these feely states, they never work. What is it to have the experience of tasting mint, if and only if you chew on mint leaves? No, you gave examples where that's going to fail both ways. What is it to be in pain? Well, it's if and only if you have those ABC conditions, aversive and whatever the beliefs?
This is my little, the ABC is the aversive behavior causal.
Yeah, okay, no, that doesn't work either, they fail both ways, they're neither necessary nor sufficient. So we think, yeah, that's not gonna work. How about this? Okay, suppose we can somehow specify these feely states. It's in terms of what you typically get when you hit your finger with a hammer, that's what pain is. And now we wonder, well, you know, it's not pain behavior, that's not gonna be the fundamental thing. Let's look deeper. It has to do with some kind of neurological causes. Maybe they're not, maybe there's several that are sufficient, but we think, maybe whenever you have this brain state, or in general some nervous state, then you have pain. So those attempts at the physicalism at specifying it at a more abstract or not fundamental level, they're all failed. But the physicalists should say, don't give up so quickly.
Yes.
Because we ought to look at the brain states, or maybe we have to look down to the atoms or the quarks or who knows what. But that's what physicalists should say. If we get to the fundamental level, we will always get consciousness, feely consciousness.
Well, probably not at the fundamental level. I mean, it would have to at least interact with the rest of our brains. So,
That's part of the fundamental level.
So physicalists probably are, I mean, I think ought to say, yeah, those feely states, those are neurological states. And this is a really weird view, and one that people think is strange, because you're going to have to say something like, yeah, see that pattern of activation? Suppose we're looking at a brain, or at least we're looking at a representation of a brain. Yeah, that pattern of activation, that's pain.
They don't have to be identity theorists. They can say that's what always causes pain. It supervenes on those states.
Yeah.
Because it failed, physicalism failed at these silly, more, I don't know,
But I mean,
higher level states, who cares?
So this is where some people think physicalism is kind of crazy, because, and this goes back to Leibniz. Leibniz imagines walking around in a giant machine. He's thinking of like a watch or something being shrunk down, walking around in it. He says, where is the thought? Where is the feeling? I don't see it. Well, you're going to have to say, if you're a physicalist, that thing. Imagine a representation of a brain where, say, this clump of neurons is firing really fast. Say, oh, that's pain. Now, that's a different presentation of your representation of that state is very different than feeling pain. And you're going to have to say, though, that it's the same state. Those are two different presentations of the same state. When you're feeling pain and when you're watching the brain with
I think only identity theorist has to say that.
No, okay.
That a physicalist has to say that everything ultimately depends on the physical. That doesn't mean that in your metaphysics you only have physical. There may be emergent states, but if you pull out the physical, they're gone.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're not an identity theorist. You don't think they're identical.
I mean, I guess the way I would think of it, though, is, remember, so you could say that there are, as it were, narrowly physical properties like charge, spin, mass, maybe not mass. Narrowly physical fundamental properties, possibly spatial temporal relations, possibly not. Some people think those are not fundamental now. And then broadly physical properties are ones like the chair has, ones that are determined or necessitated by the arrangements of those narrowly physical properties. The physicalist has to say that pain is one of those broadly physical properties. It may or may not be identical to what I was thinking, the firing rate of these neurons or something like that.
Right.
I think it is direct. I mean, if the computer is brain, the neurophysics that we react to stimuli. We have the logical circuits with the brain in the frontal cortex, but the stimuli go straight on memory. So if we get a direct stimuli like pain, it goes straight to our memory and we react on what happened in the past, as opposed to rarer occasions where we don't have a direct stimuli that requires action. Then that could enter the frontal cortex where they speculate the logical gates would be, and those logical gates could actually rework the mental circuits.
It's got to be more complex than that, and I'll mention the example I used a minute ago. Why are you in this room rather than one next door?
It's a memory circuit combined with a logical decision. If we're at the luxury where we're not currently in pain, we could enter our logical circuit and combine that with our memory. As opposed when we're in a state of
pain. The point of the
pain,
example is just
it's only the memory that's effective.
What you were saying is that
That's the current neurological best
is that
explanation.
most of our action kind of bypasses the frontal cortex and goes straight from memory or something like that.
We react to stimuli, react straight to memory.
Of course, there's lots of action that is automatic, and a lot of that is irrational. But let's not forget that there's a whole lot of our action that clearly makes use of thought, and it's just so mundane that you don't recognize it, like coming to this room rather than the one down the hall because it's got the right number on it. So, there you go.
One last question? Somebody? Else?
I'm kind of stuck on the whole computer analogy because it's like so many of these terms like rationality and logic. I mean, do they have any straight definition, or could it just? Because I'm also thinking about when you link that to decision theory, and I'm like, okay then. So is it just simply a matter of different programming for different people? Decisions made are just simply made on different metrics.
It'd be like logic gates. Like computer chips have logic gates, so would our frontal cortex.
Or maybe even a difference between instruments that are supposed to interpret external data and programs that can interpret that data and then translate it into something the most internal processor can understand and use as part of a decision making.
Look, I don't. There are tremendously complicated things about how our thinking works that I don't pretend to understand. I do not pretend to understand them. I try to limit myself to claims like, yeah, we can do that, and we can do that. How often do we do it? I don't know, but we can. And how much of So how human thinking works is far beyond my pay grade, so to speak. There are elements of our thinking that look to be there are elements of our thinking that look like they at least approximate to processes where our only kind of good model is something like decision theories, but I certainly don't want to say that's either universal for human thought or yeah.
I would just say it's better to think of it more as a chemical process than a computer process. So chemical processes go inherently analog. There's a lot of other variables that can intervene at any stage of the process, but you can define the process. I think if you think about mental processes, you think the same way. You can define a process, but many of these elements are inherently analog, and there's a lot of things that can intervene at every step. So it's a different way of thinking than a strictly sort of computer algorithm-based, everything's more fixed, the rules are more fixed. It's far more analog than that.
Don't you think
That's where people get hung up on these computer analogies. It leads you to think more digitally, where I think when it comes to the brain processes, you have to think far more analog.
Well, also more imagistically too. I mean, there's a lot of, tremendous amounts of our brains are devoted to imagistic sorts of memories. And you can do experiments where people have an amazing ability to recognize photos. You show them a photo for a few seconds, show them 1,000 of them, and then come back an hour later and they can pick out 980 of them or something like that as ones they've seen before. So there's a lot of, I mean, how sensory representations get integrated with more conceptual ones. I'm a philosopher. I don't pretend
Yeah, but
to
that's
have, I don't
what
pretend to have
poetry
answers to questions like that.
But it would be like
Poetry
requiring,
does, you integrate those images with certain kinds of consciousness and responses to
Yeah.
language. I mean,
Yeah.
if you throw the wrong image in there, it won't fall flat. Boom.
You could stick with the computer analogy. Eric's point I thought was that the thinky part might be able to be modeled on the computer, but the feely part is gonna have trouble no matter what.
Well, it's all gonna be a mess. I mean, some of our processes at some times approximate to things we can give a more kind of rational model for, and that's all.
It promises
That's
in the
all I
thinky
would
part. The thinky
say.
part, there's a promise that the computer analogy's out, but the feely part seems like it's not gonna help at all. But I would say about the computer analogy, on the thinky part, you might say, the computer works like this. It's organized so it produces rational conclusion and stuff, but the darn computer sometimes overheats and then it goes crazy. So there's something like that inside of the machine. That's us. So it's kind of got a basic model like a computer, but then we get overheated and then we get stupid outcomes.
you have your inner cortex, which controls our action. and
I
it'd
don't
be
know, that's all within the physical model. That's for
But
some
it'd be like you need
psychologist
a
to
defrag.
figure that out.
So like you said, the evidence shows we're gonna remember it, but unless we have the time to defrag, we're still gonna act according to our internal memories, and that's what the brain scans show. Our action will go straight to our historical trained reaction unless we have some sort of defrag which reworks the logical circuits for action-reaction. We're actually
We
incapable
don't
of
have
making on-the-spot
we don't have
logical.
logic circuits. We know we don't have logic circuits.
Well, it could be a defrag. At some point,
Like
there's a defrag.
we're not, okay, I shouldn't say that.
All right.